You are now listening to 1-900 Old Ladies, The Lost Art of Making Lefse, written by L. Lee Starr, narrated by the author. Post-production by Pinto Media. Chapter 7. First thing in the morning when you get up, you take the cold potatoes out of the ice box. Then you rice them. You stick each potato quarter in the ricer and you squeeze the handle very tight. That's why you make sure and cook the potatoes soft, eh? That way you don't have to work so hard squeezing them. Your arm will be good and tired by the time you're done with 10 pounds. Maybe if you're lucky, you can get one of the boys to help you out. They love to smash things. Sigrid Sigurdsson. Robert Peters' memorial service was held in Himmel shortly after his remains were brought back home. Robert's mother and grandmother graciously asked Ellen to sit with them during the service. Seated also next to Robert's mother was a very unwelcomed Stanley Sr., who made his first appearance in the town. He had nothing to do with Robert from the time he was 15, but he not only finagled his way into the memorial service, he claimed direct responsibility for Robert's achievements and sacrifices for his country. He also used the opportunity to brag about his own injuries, which he sustained during World War II. He even had the audacity to sit in the seat of honor, accepting his son's folded flag on the family's behalf. The whole thing made Ellen sick to think about it. "Can you believe that bastard?" Robert's mother whispered to her. Ellen shook her head in disbelief as she sat weeping for her dead lover. Sitting on the edge of Stanley's bed, holding the portrait of Robert, Ellen thought about her relationship with Stanley's first son and their almost continual exchange of letters from the time she left for Dickinson College in 1958. She had often wondered if he had kept and treasured each of her letters as she did his. Even after he went off to college and enlisted in the army, she thought of him almost every waking moment and wrote him nearly every day. She considered her final letter to Robert, which she sent a week before he was killed. She knew that he probably never received it. She wondered if he had managed to keep any of those letters during his short time in Vietnam. What might have become of them? Had he even received any of them? Then Ellen suddenly remembered that Stanley had received the entire contents of Robert's footlocker after they sent his body back, and he kept it all hidden in the barn. Since Stan Sr. had claimed ownership of the dilapidated family barn, this space had long been declared off limits to the rest of the family. Of course, he had hoarded so many tools in there during the course of their marriage, there wasn't really much room for anyone to use the space for anything else, much less as an actual barn. Stanley regarded the building as an oversized warehouse for all his stuff. The barn itself hadn't been painted since Father was alive. The roof now leaked terribly, and the loft sagged. If a large crow were to perch himself there on top of the boxes Stanley had stored there, the entire thing might come crashing down at any minute. Determined to satisfy her curiosity, Ellen marched back to the decrepit barn, making her way up the rickety wooden ladder to the loft above. As she stood upright on the loft, the creaking beneath her feet made her feel especially uneasy. There were piles of old, musty boxes stacked on top of one another. Some boxes were so worn and deteriorated, they were completely crushed under the weight of the old, musty boxes stacked above them. Ellie started her search at the top of Stanley's stack of boxes. She grabbed the top box, pulled it down, flipped open the tabs, and examined the contents. The first box was filled with small hand tools. When she had concluded that the box did not contain that which she sought, she cast the box and its contents from the loft onto the floor below and proceeded to search through the next box. Some of the boxes contained possessions Stanley had acquired long before he met Ellen, which he had carted with him when he moved from Texas. One box contained some World War II memorabilia Stanley had carried with him from his time during the service. There was a small collection of photographs from his previous marriage to Robert's mother and of Robert when he was small. Most of the boxes contained items of little value to anyone but Stanley. In truth, most of the items should have been hauled to the trash heap 27 years before. She briefly studied the contents of each box, deciding that she had no interest in it. Then she tossed the box off the loft onto the floor below. As she tossed the boxes and their contents, some of which were breakable, to the main floor, she felt herself being expunged of all her intense rage. Sometimes, when she heard the sound of breaking glass below, she felt vindicated and let out an almost corrupt and distorted belly laugh. As Ellen surveyed the remaining 3 boxes left on the upper loft, she spotted another musty cardboard box with the name Robert etched in Stanley's handwriting. She gasped, knelt down in the straw, and gazed into it. There, in the crushed and mildewed box, were the contents of Robert's footlocker. Ellie pulled each item out of the box and handled them gingerly, as if they were prized antiques. These were the items that Robert had kept with him during the war, she thought to herself. She studied a photo of her as a young girl he had probably kept in his breast pocket. She pulled out his musty army uniform, his dog tags, even his socks. She smiled as she caressed each item, and as she lamented about the life that she and Robert could no longer have together, she wept pitifully to herself. Finally, at the bottom of the box of Robert's belongings, Ellen discovered, tied together with a small strip of twine, every letter she had ever mailed to him during his time in the army. She held her breath as she kissed the stack of letters she had penned to her lover. She lovingly rubbed them against her tear-stained cheek and carefully untied the twine knot, freeing the collection from its 27-year bondage. Robert had kept every letter that Ellen had written to him in his footlocker, and the entire stack had been returned to his father after his death. After Ellie had freed the lost letters, she read each one to herself. Each letter had been carefully opened at the flap by Robert's loving hand, read and reread by him during his rare moments alone. As she read, she imagined him lying in his lonely bunk or in the trenches somewhere, dreaming of Ellen and the life they would share together when he returned. Each letter had been carefully opened at the flap by Robert and then was restored back into its sacred envelope hiding place. Each letter, that is, except for the last letter. That letter, Ellen's final letter to Robert, was never opened with his careful and loving hand. In her final letter to Robert, Ellen revealed a tragic secret, a secret which Robert would never survive to learn. But someone had read the letter. It had been barbarically torn at the short end and savagely extracted. And that letter was so clumsily extricated that there was no hope of ever restoring the contents safely to its tidy and carefully sealed envelope. No, Robert never lived long enough to understand the truth about Ellen's dark secret. But Ellen was now sure that Stanley had read the letter. Ellen seethed in anger. She had endured 27 miserable years of continued abuse from her husband. She was constantly ridiculed by him. Stanley watched Ellie slowly die over the years, riddled by guilt and the belief that she harbored this terrible secret. But now she realized, Stanley has known my secret all along. Fuming, Ellie now channeled her inconceivable rage and resentment towards Stanley into Herculean power and might. She threw the remaining boxes of the loft down onto the growing heap below without even taking the time to examine the remainder of the contents therein. Descending the steps of the loft, she dragged every tool to the center of the barn floor. She started with the larger items, plows, tractors, wheelbarrows, saws, his old worn workbench, and even an old buggy carriage. She piled each tool precariously and dangerously onto the heavier tools below. All these things Stanley had acquired. An old lathe he purchased at an auction were relocated there, in the center of this huge pile. She carried, lugged, pushed, and dragged every piece of miserable equipment Stanley ever purchased to the center of this growing mound. For years, the presence of Stanley's endless collection of belongings had defiled Father's barn, had wrecked her home, and had ruined her life. After Ellie had dragged the larger tools and equipment to the center of the barn floor, she relocated all the heavier hand tools on top of the largest items. Wheels, scythes, hoes, pitchforks, machetes, rakes, shovels, gears, and pulleys. All these lighter, but more dangerous items were stacked onto the growing heap. In fact, this heap was so tall, Ellen now employed the use of a barn ladder to add to it. She ignored the agonizing pain in her back. Her arms throbbed from overexertion. She mourned for her lost love and her wasted youth. Stanley knew how deeply I loved Robert. Stanley has always known. Stanley's mountain of tools now soared beyond reach, almost to the barn ceiling, and Ellen, perched on her tiptoes at the very top step of her ladder, daringly piled the final item at its peak. She deliberately set Stanley's empty Folgers coffee tin on top, and in the tin, Ellen placed the open stack of letters she had written to Robert so many years ago. Yes, you want your beloved tools, Stanley? Come get them. They're yours to take. After she had placed the pièce de résistance on top of her monument to Stanley's wastefulness and selfishness, she clapped her hands together, admiring her work. It was bitterly cold in the barn, but she was warmed by a sense of self-satisfaction, almost as if she had placed the final star on her annual Christmas tree. She grinned, descended her ladder, took it down, and then hid it out behind the barn. She left the barn doors open wide. Then she followed the trail of old clothes she had left strewn in a path all the way back to the front porch of the house. It was now dusk. She had spent the entire day relocating every bit of Stanley's scrap out in the barn or tossing it into the trash heap. She flipped on the kitchen lights in order to see more clearly as she entered her dilapidated farmhouse. Click, click, click. Nothing happened. "Oh, my goodness," Ellen declared. Beat, she flopped herself on her favorite wing chair in the darkness of her living room. While she had kept herself embroiled in her day of rediscovery and redecorating, the power company had shut off her power. Later that evening, in her kitchen now illuminated with emergency candles, Ellen Peters moved the groceries from her Frigidaire icebox to the heap of snow outside her front door. She shut the door, stoked a small fire in her pot-bellied stove, and suspended several of her best knitted blankets and quilts over the old windows of her home in order to help insulate herself against the invading winter blast. Exhausted, she sat in front of the pot-bellied stove and picked up her knitting needles. Her hands were frozen, but she was determined to finish knitting Margie's hot pink sweater, this time by firelight. The next morning, Ellen rose and left the warmth of her stove and ventured out onto the front porch. Her potatoes had cooled in the snow and were wrapped under plastic. The temperature outside was far below freezing, and the potatoes were now partly frozen through. She needed to let them thaw inside a little before she riced them. She let the cooked potatoes thaw about an hour. Afterward, Ellie assembled her ricing equipment. This was a heavy-duty stainless steel hand ricer, which she operated by inserting the potato quarter into the opening, closing the lid down, and squeezing the spud through a series of holes in a die. When enough pressure had been applied to the soft potato, the squeezed potato emerged as a bunch of soft noodles, which were then incorporated into the flour dough for lefse. The ricing process required a considerable amount of manual strength, which Ellen did not have. She had spent the previous afternoon toting large pieces of machinery and tools to the center of her huge barn, forming a colossal mountain of Stanley's tools at the center of the main floor. In addition, she had spent the previous morning exhaustively clearing every bit of Stanley's possessions out of her farmhouse. She wasn't really sure what had possessed her to do all those things. She admitted to herself that she found all yesterday's activities somewhat therapeutic. But today, Ellie simply had no energy left. She tried to muster any bit of arm strength she could manage in order to rice the potatoes. At one point, she was so frustrated, she placed an empty bowl down on the floor and tried smashing the ricer handle down with her foot. Exasperated, Ellie tossed her ricer and frozen potatoes on the kitchen floor. She sprawled out on the floor and leaned her head against the kitchen cabinet, whining miserably like a toddler having a tantrum. A quarter of a mile down the driveway, a roadway tractor trailer pulled up to the mailbox. Stan Sr. jumped out of the passenger's side of the cab, holding his Samsonite suitcase. When he had slammed the cab door shut, he tapped on it with his cane and saluted to the trucker. The trucker nodded and drove off. Then Stan hobbled his way up the cold driveway to his North Dakota farmhouse. As Stanley Sr. neared the farmhouse, he noticed the trail of clothing which led from the front porch of the farmhouse, winding its way around the back of the house and leading out to the barn. "What the?" he whispered to himself, puzzled. His eye followed the tempting trail of breadcrumbs around the side of the house. He cursed when he discovered his favorite armchair had been mercilessly discarded in the snow, exposed to the harsh North Dakota elements. "That fucking bitch!" he cried. He continued along the trail of clothing, observing that his other prized possessions had been disposed of in the trash heap and were now scheduled for incineration. "I'm gonna fucking kill her!" he screamed. Furious, he followed the clothing trail still further as it stretched directly through the open barn doors. Now he was compelled by both anger and curiosity, and as he entered the barn, he marveled at the massive mountain of machinery and miscellaneous matter his poor, frail wife had assembled the previous day. Perched atop this precariously situated colossus was his makeshift safe deposit box, the old Folgers coffee tin. He could see that there was something in the can. He just couldn't see clearly what it was. What the fuck? What the hell did that bitch put up there? He dropped his cane to search for a ladder, but there was no ladder to be found. He decided that he would cautiously climb on top of his saw, then step up to the workbench, carefully moving on to the next higher item for support. Securing his foothold and eventually making his way up the pile, then he could examine whatever prize lay in store for him after he retrieved the coffee tin. Stanley was both slothful and crippled, but his intense curiosity motivated him to maneuver this pile of crap his wife had brilliantly assembled. As he reached the halfway point of his machinery mountain, he stretched the tips of his fingers toward the coffee can, now just barely out of reach. He leaned over ever so slightly. Unfortunately, he lost his balance and his foothold and fell almost 20 feet before hitting the ground and landing with a loud thud. After Stanley Peters plummeted to the ground below, the hazardous stockpile of tools and equipment his wife had so deliberately arranged began to shake. Seconds later, the massive pile came crashing down on top of him, tragically crushing his body beneath its tremendous weight.